Hey there, IndyCar fans. This is Nathan Brown, your motorsports insider at the IndyStar, along with my podcast co-host, Joey Barnes. I know we've taped an episode or two in the month of May, but truly feels like the first true, honest month of May episode we've got. I'm taping here at the IMS Media Center as we get on for today's episode of the Inside Line to talk about the Indianapolis 500 as well as action we had on the IMS road course a couple days ago for the Sonsio Grand Prix. Before we get to 500 talk, as you probably know, Alex Palou wins his fourth out of 5 races this season. He holds more than a 90-point lead 5 races into the 17-race IndyCar schedule in 2025, and feels like it's as we look less than 2 weeks away. If he doesn't come away from the 500 a first-time Indy 500 winner, almost maybe a little bit of a disappointment. To get into all of that, my co-host Joey Barnes. Joey, thanks for joining me again. Feels like Alex Palou winning another race would be pretty tough to do an Alex Palou drinking game on this pod. Every single episode just been Alex Palou history, wins. Can he win a 500? Pretty incredible run for the driver of the number 10 Chip Ganassi Racing Honda this year.
It's disgusting. It's just absolutely disgusting, and all the best and worst ways, really. Right? Like we're losing the variety or the versatility of so many things, but also we haven't had a beatdown like this. I think the stat was the last time that anybody opened up the season winning 4 out of 5 was Sebastian Bourdais in 2006.
Yep, that's right.
So there's something to be appreciated, even with kind of this new formula that is in IndyCar right now that is more challenging. But yeah, it's something special, and we continue to joke, and now it's become a running thing on social media too, of the Thanos glove. We need him to show up with the Thanos glove at the 500 now, just left hand, 1 gold racing glove, with all the infinity stones in it, maybe with the exception of 1. But it's going to be fascinating to see if this momentum can sustain itself on the oval. We know that that's the one thing that's kind of missing. We know that Ganassi cars are really good. And now we turn the page to that, looking ahead. But I think before doing all of that and getting kind of crazy into the 500 speak that we're all excited about for the month of May, we did have this road course race. We did have what I thought was a pretty entertaining race on the IMS road course, honestly. I mean, for all intents and purposes, there may not have been as much passing as last year's race, but it certainly felt like there was just more just interesting things to follow, one of which was the mandatory tire selection, where you had to run both sets of tires twice, the alternate and the primes. And we had Graham Rahal taking the lead from Palou on the opening lap. This is less than 24 hours after Rahal said, "I don't know how we're going to beat those guys."
The opening turn of the opening lap in the match.
Yeah, it just phenomenal push from him, and you could tell that he absolutely drove his tail off and just tried. And unfortunately, there wasn't enough there. I think it was right after the second to last pit stop, going into the final pit stop stint, where they were running he was on alternates and Palou was on primes, if I recall. And Palou was able to make the primes work enough to stalk him enough to get that push and get by. And then it just became kind of catastrophic for Rahal. Just, right as he was pitting, you think he's going to have a chance to maybe push forward at the end, but whenever he's leaving his pit box, he got held for a second just because Kirkwood was coming in. Otherwise, there could have been a collision, and it could have been an even more disastrous day for him. But, so you feel for him on that. I feel for Graham on that perspective, because he was in the fight, and you got to feel like there's a little bit of rejuvenation for him, knowing that they had something to fight with. But the race itself, I mean, we finally had a caution, right? And then we had like a 13-lap sprint to the finish, where Palou had to, I say fend off, but I don't know if you could say he really had to defend, because he skated off into the distance once more. But, right ahead of the Arrow McLaren Chevrolet of Pato Award, and just ahead of Will Power. And there's a lot of good days for some people, but there was also just some weirdness to the day. You had issues in the start of the race. You had stuff going on during the race. There was a little bit of everything in this thing.
Yeah, it's we're getting into this point in this championship battle, and again, I know we're only 5 races in. We've yet to run an oval, so we've still got a long ways to go. But the ways in which Alex Palou's rivals and challengers in this championship battle have just been so all over the board. This season, outside of maybe Christian Lundgaard, and then Christian goes and has a 16th place finish today, on Saturday. So probably some of that still there for him even too. But you look at guys like Pato O'Ward and Kyle Kirkwood and Will Power, Scott Dixon, Scott McLaughlin, Colton Herta, Joseph Newgarden. I mean, you got guys finishing in the top 5 or even on the podium one week and then finishing well outside the top 10 the next week. It's just and I say all that because you wondered when you got that restart just past the lap 70 moment after David Malukas had a mechanical failure that ended his day, left him stranded in the grass with under 20 laps to go in this race. You wondered if Pato or Power would make a really bold, daring move down the outside coming into turn 1 that then quickly turns into having the inside line in turn 2, which is essentially how Graham Rahal was able to snatch that lead away from Palou on the run immediately after the green flag. You wondered if someone would make a move, but these guys so badly need just a podium finish for their own seasons to get them in a decent spot, not just compared to Palou, but compared to the rest of the run of guys that are in this stretch from 2nd place to 8th or 9th place. That's a smaller margin than what Palou has from 1st place to 2nd place. So not surprised that Alex was able to manage that restart as well as we've ever seen him do it. He was on sticker alternate tires there, although he was probably halfway through his stint or so. So they were not exactly fresh, and there were questions whether, had he eaten these up too much, trying to, as he got on them and then just trying to sprint away from Graham and Pato and the rest of the field to start that 4th and final stint there. But clearly there wasn't plenty enough life in those tires. And it seems like maybe no coincidence that the top 5, I think, in this race ended the race on sticker alternate tires. We'll get into tire strategy and choices here in a second, but Alex and the number 10 Chip Ganassi Racing Honda crew do what they do, out-strategized, out-raced, and as Graham Rahal said after the race, just are performing and operating and have a car that is racing at another level than the entire rest of the field. He even made the comparison that he felt like Dixon had maybe the 2nd best pace on the track on Saturday. He said that no one was really able to make any ground up on him when he was fending guys off, whether it was Palou during good chunks of the race or in that latter stint where he was trying to fight and stay on the podium and ultimately finished 6th. He said Dixon and Palou just kind of had seemingly another gear. I think he even said in a short interview after the race to a small group of reporters that were down there with him at his pit box that felt like the Ganassi cars had 10 more pounds of boost in the car that other cars didn't have. And I talked to Chip Ganassi after the race. He said he didn't feel like his team is, there's any one thing that this team has just really figured out on this car, although it certainly feels like he's just gave a sense that he feels like everyone in this group is really executing well. Alex is driving the car well. They're getting great pit stops. They're making the correct strategy calls, doing the little things really well. And when you've got a team that's got decades of greatness hitting on all cylinders and a team that has won 3 of the last 4 championships with Alex and 4 out of the last 5 when we go back to Dixon in 2020, seemingly just a really tough team to beat. And Graham Rahal and Rahal, Letterman, Lanigan Racing gave everything they could to it. In the end, it just wasn't enough. And this was also a race where you had so many of these great teams qualifying so far down, to where it was a true achievement just to get up into the podium of the top 5. You had Pato O'Ward starting this race 8th, finishing 2nd, kind of like his teammate Christian Lundgaard did at Barber, where he started 7th and finished 2nd. You had Will starting 7th, Scott Dixon starting 16th and finishing 5th, and then you kind of counterbalance that to those 3 RLL cars that started 2nd, 3rd, and 5th, where Ray Hall finishes 6th, Louis Foster finishes 11th, and Devlin D. Francesco falls and finishes 17th. It's just, qualifying has seemingly been this kind of surprise across Saturdays or Fridays, in this case for this race weekend, where you have this wide spread of guys that you consider championship contenders finishing up or down, and then it seems like those guys that have great Saturdays oftentimes can't really capitalize very much on their Sundays, and you've got others doing vice versa. And seemingly Alex Palou, he's locked up poles for each of the last 2 races, and kind of run away with it, even though he did, of course, lose the race to the start of this one and run off. You mentioned the new tire rule and tire strategy. I thought it was a really interesting one. We got some mixed thoughts from the drivers. Scott Dixon, I know, gave an interview on pit lane after the race and thought it was a ridiculous move from IndyCar, and felt like they were taking, a step too far into kind of manipulating and trying to orchestrate entertainment or orchestrate good racing, which I think there's probably something to. And for a driver who has such a good car, and I'm sure would have loved to have been able to run 3 stints on these alternate tires, when you feel like you've got the best, or maybe the second best car on the grid, and you've got a rule that's kind of leveling the field a little bit and making it easier for other teams, and taking away an advantage from a team that has such a good car on these alternates. I can understand Dixon's frustrations, but we got some interesting comments from Pato O'Ward and Will Power after the race. I know you've got those pulled up in front of you, on what they thought about having to, teams having to run 2 sets of primaries and 2 sets of alternates throughout the race. Again, not having to, it wasn't determined whether they had to be sticker or whether they had to be used, and there was a variety of strategy for guys throughout the race, and also a variety of what teams had at their disposal, depending on whether you qualified in the Fast 6 or in the Fast 12, whether you had 1 set of stickers or 2 sets of stickers, and how that ended up impacting the race. But what are some of the things that you took away from Pato and Will's comments as they look ahead to the potential of this rule getting adopted long-term in the series?
Yeah, so it's interesting because during the post-race press conference, I mean, this is literally verbatim from Pato. He goes, and I quote, he goes, "I think the tire rule, at least from our side, that was pretty eventful, I would say. I would be keen to be seeing that in Detroit because of the green tire," in which case Power chimed in and was like, "That would be cool." And Pato just continued to talk about how, and we'll end the quote there, and I'll paraphrase from here, is just that he would like to have seen it done in St. Pete and Long Beach, and believes this is something that, they just got to do something to stop Palou. Not sure if this is it necessarily, but it's interesting because we've seen what the tire wear is on the street circuits in particular, and that we run the green tire as opposed to the reds that we get on road courses and whatnot. So it would be fascinating to see if this is implemented for there, because we've seen what the degradation is on street circuits and how that would come to be. I don't know if it makes that big of a difference on street circuits, but again, I'm not the one in the car. Having said that, I think this is I think it's a step in the right direction. Like in terms of trying to find something to bring variety. I think you've got to watch. There's a fine line of because there were some comments on social media that almost made it sound as if they felt that this was gimmicky. And I didn't necessarily look at the tire. I never think that trying to make certain tire combinations mandatory is gimmicky. I think that it's part of the puzzle. It's part of the game. But we all know, because we complained about this, you and I, even in the last pod after Barber, of just, we knew that IndyCar had to do something. We applauded them for trying to think about something. This was a step towards something, and it was an experiment. It was something we learned from, and it did make the race more entertaining. You wouldn't have, I didn't know until I looked up the stat this morning that this race only had 142 passes for position. Last year had 233 passes for position. I didn't care. I didn't care if there was that fewer passes. I was genuinely drawn into a little bit of the drama and a little bit of the chaos. I mean, if it wasn't, unfortunate for Kiffin Simpson there with his issue at the start of the race, and he couldn't get going. But like, you had Joseph messing up with trying to get in line and having to start at the back of the field, and you had Graham with this great start. There was a lot of variety blended into this race. You had Chargers in this race. Part of that because they decided to try different strategies because of the mandatory tire rule. So it brought another element to it that made it fun. I would say that, and this is something that I know we talked just before we jumped on the pod, and I had some time to think about this since last time, because we've been talking about, you can't wait around for the new car, et cetera. And I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on the new car talk, but trying to find a solution for right now. And the more I thought about it and trying to do it a cost-effective way, and it's probably not one that manufacturers would enjoy hearing, but the more I think about it, the more I'm like, this is probably about a power to weight ratio. We continue to add weight to these cars, and we've just chunked a ton of weight over the years. It's not just the hybrid. It's the aero screen. It's so many other elements that have just been bolted on to this 14, 15-year-old chassis. I think you increase the power. You're going to force people to be brave at times, maybe a little too brave, but I mean, that's part of racing as it is. And I think if you did that could fix a lot of problems. But having said that, does that fix everything? I have no idea. But I think that maybe with the playing around with this tire rule could lead to some entertaining things.
I think the tough thing that we could run into, and while agreeing with you, and I think it's a good idea, and I'm down for trying things that aren't, stage racing and mandatory pit stops and things like that just get a little bit too gimmicky and for entertainment, rather than just rules that add some, intricacies into how things work on track, kind of like what the hybrid is. I mean, when it really comes down to it, it's another tool for drivers to use in the car, and it's another tool to strategize around for teams about how to best optimize what you have at your disposal for the car. I think the one thing that we could run into if we're thinking about that for the future, say in 2026, ahead of a car that we hope we get some portion of, and what Mark Miles, frankly, has said definitively that we will get something new in 2027. Now, whether that's the whole car, I have my doubts on that. I think the thing that you could run into with really boosting the power and the horsepower on these cars for, say, 2026 is, are engine manufacturers really going to be interested in, the additional development and work that would take in the off season to best strategize around that, when it's only going to be for 1 year, unless we keep this engine formula into the next iteration of IndyCar. I certainly hope is not the case, but seems like definitely a possibility.
We were told, though, you remember this at Mid-Ohio last year, and we could go away from the engine for a second and just go to the hybrid, but we were told that even the hybrid has the capacity for significant jumps.
Yes, that's true. And so maybe you can do something more with the hybrid, although
I would rather see it from the power plant personally, though.
I agreed. And that's what I'm saying. Like, I don't know that, if we, this engine, runs somewhere around 700 horsepower, if memory serves me right. I don't know if there's going to be a lot of interest in, from the manufacturers seeing this jump up to 800 or so, just strictly from the internal combustion engine, when you've got some added risk of these blowing and having to work really hard in the background over the 6-month off season to optimize that, if it truly is only going to be around for another year, if we're going to say get into a new engine formula. If you decide, hey, this is going to be, we're going to stay with the 2.2 liter turbocharged V6 for IndyCar's next chapter of technical regulations, and you add boosts to that, and you also bump up the hybrid, then maybe we're getting into some interesting things, and maybe bumping up the hybrid in 2026 is something that you can tinker with in terms of seeing how it reacts on what you might do in 27 or 28. Now, I personally hope we've got a completely different hybrid system that's not something that just had to be the proper square peg that you could fit into a round hole that the series and the manufacturers used to put a hybrid system on the track midway through last year. I hope this is a new technology that is best fit for a new car, and the proper, given the weight constraints and the size constraints, I hope there's a little bit more freedom there to develop. But I definitely think you've got to do something to make this car more raceable again, and more power, seemingly, with a car as heavy it is now, is certainly a good idea. And I like this tire strategy. I think the one question that I have, and it would take some time to really go through and look through several years of results at certain race tracks that we have on the schedule. But I know, for example, the first 2 years of this Detroit street course, the winners, although we've had so many darn yellow flags where strategies have gotten a little bit thrown out the window for some cars, but the winners have only had 2 pit stops. So are you telling a Scott Dixon that kind of, I think, fuel saved his way to that win in 2023 as chaos was going on around him, and he and the number 9 CGR Honda team, I think, rode out a lot of those yellow flags and stayed on track and kept a track position and trusted that they were going to be able to use some fuel strategy to get to the end? Are you telling that team that that advantage that you have in fuel saving is no longer going to be something that you can use and rely on? I certainly bet a Scott Dixon would be super pissed off about that. So it's something that I don't know if you could do, if you are essentially just saying you have to have 3 pit stops at every single track. I think you lose a little bit of strategy on one end, but maybe the ways in which that strategy is changed and put toward what tires you're running when, and what tires you preserved for the race through through practice that weekend. Maybe the added benefit of where you qualify, giving you one more set of sticker tires, or what guys do during qualifying and whether they use stickers or scuffs or use alternates, what have you. There's some interesting things that you could do there, but I would hate to lose a little bit of fuel economy stuff that I know there are some teams that have gotten so good at and see as a outright advantage in some races when it comes to that. But I enjoyed it. I mean, we can go through the Firestone tire tracker and talk a little bit about what teams did. You had a handful of teams start this race on either, it seemed like the main choice was either used alternates, new primaries, or in Graham Rahal's choice there, they actually started on their one and only new alternate set that they had, which I thought was an interesting but probably somewhat bold move that Graham made. Ultimately, it probably helped him a little bit make that pass going into one and create whatever level of advantage he had on Palou through the first chunk of that race. Although, I mean, ultimately it proved to be, Graham just wasn't able to create enough distance to where he was going to be able to run away and hide from Alex Palou, and that's not necessarily surprising. I think they rolled the dice. They tried to do what they could
Well,
But
I mean, also though, I know I don't mean to cut you off, but I'll say
yeah,
this, that by that going with that strategy, I think that, and I don't want to put words in Graham's mouth or the team's mouth, and if this is not what they meant, but like how I interpreted it is a good way to say it is. I thought it was like, hey, let's find out how big of an advantage clean air is over this tire
yeah,
combination.
sure.
And he went out to a pretty good lead real early on. I mean, what did he have, like a 5-second advantage at one point, I want to say, or something of that sort?
I didn't remember it being that big, but you very well could be right on that.
I mean, he went out to a pretty good lead. I mean, he was up at 12 car lengths after just a couple laps for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it was fascinating to see, honestly, that how durable the Reds were on that early stint. So, you know, you bet on clean air, maybe it works, but I mean, everybody's gambling, right? I mean, that's effectively what this is. I think what I was kind of fascinated with was that the used Reds were so effective, considering they had already gone through one heat cycle in qualifying or practice or whenever they were being scuffed. And the fact that they, like Palou, started on used Reds and was able to kind of just hang out and respond. And then equally how the primaries kind of came in over the course of a run. So the one thing was very evident though, is that if you started, with the exception of, well, I don't even want to say with the exception of, if you started on primaries, you were a guy who was gonna charge late. That's where you got your Scotty Mack finishing fourth, your Scott Dixon finishing fifth, your Kyle Kirkwoods and Renus VKs that had abysmal qualifying runs that managed to charge back up there. You know, Marcus Armstrong too, for that matter, finishing seventh. So I guess, do you think one was, I mean, obviously we know which one won, but do you look at this and think like that this formula can legitimately work at other tracks?
I think it certainly seems clear to me that unless you're someone that just really feels like you need to make a jump early when the field's bunched up and you don't know if you're going to get a caution, it certainly seems like running that that new set of alternates in that final stint is the best way to go about things. But if everyone is doing that and you need to think a little bit outside the box, and that's kind of what Graham spoke to a little bit after the race. They decided not to go and match Palou on tire to tire. Now you don't know what tire anyone else other than your team is starting on to start the race. So Graham decides, Graham and the number 15 team decide to start the race on their new sticker set of alternates, and Palou and a handful of guys start on used. Both teams went to primaries after that, but the big decision ultimately for Graham and Alex was Graham threw on his final set of alternates he had at his disposal in that third stint of the race after the second pit stop, and those were used versus Palou's new primaries. And for the second race in a row, we've seen, at Barber, it was Palou gapping someone. I think it was maybe in that second stint where Lundgaard was charging, second or third stint where Lundgaard was charging on maybe Lundgaard or Herta. I actually think it was Herta in that second stint, was on maybe used alternates, and Palou was on new primaries and actually was able to create a gap to Colton in that race at Barber. And he did the same thing on Graham. Graham in that third stint was on used alternates. Palou was on new primaries. And there was the added level of difficulty for Graham having the nearly but not entirely lapped car of Colton Herta there, kind of just getting by those first three in line and then not really being able to move up through the field beyond that. Graham had some frustrating comments after the race on, wondering what Colton was doing, what the purpose of, trying to unlap himself and passing those three cars to, move up the field only to not really drive away from anyone after that. I think it hurt Graham to be in clean air. It really used up his that used set of alternates that he had, and probably made it that much easier for Palou to, first of all, kind of maintain the second to second and a half gap that he had to Graham in that point in the race. And then, as Graham's tires fell off, Alex, charged, found the right moment, nearly made a pass going around the outside into one, just kind of sucked up super duper close, and then eventually pounced on the back straight on the run heading into 7, and the race was kind of over from there. Before we jump into some Indy 500 practice week talk, are there any other performances that you want to touch on in the race? We saw, as you mentioned, I think a couple times, Joseph Newgarden has his first Fast 6 appearance of the season, and then I think they had another MGU issue. I think they suffered one at Barber, maybe during a practice or leading into a practice, and he has to, I think, run through the pits, although I'm not even sure if he had to stop, but he kind of falls back as the field is doing their parade laps, not able to make it up to his proper starting spot that he should have been in as the field was forming. And so because of that, they had to call off the start, run the first lap of the race under yellow, and Joseph is forced to start last in this race that was kind of chaotic early with various mechanical issues. Kiffin Simpson, you mentioned, never started the race. Colton Herta had some issues. Marcus Ericsson had a weird seemingly engine issue there. And Joseph, I think, works his way back up to 12th place. So doesn't technically, in the record books, gain 15 spots, but for all intents and purposes made up 14 to 15 spots in the race. But just another frustrating performance from him and that number 2 Chevy team as they're coming into such a big couple weeks as Joseph tries to make history. Any other performances that really stood out to you?
Honestly, Patos. I think I think you have to ask the question about Arrow McLaren right now are they the second best team? I mean, we started to look at this and we go, okay, Christian Lundgaard's got 3 podiums in a row. Granted, one of those podiums was when Pato finished runner-up at Thermal. Almost won that race, if not for the one other on-track pass for the lead that has existed this season outside of the one Palou pulled on Graham this past weekend. But
Graham made one in lap 1 too.
Oh, that's true. So we got 3. But no, the point is, I mean, you're looking at this organization, and one, Pato needed to respond, right? I mean, Christian doing what he did, there was some chatter. Pato needed to respond. Pato did respond. But this is 3 runner-up finishes out of Arrow McLaren in 5 races this season. They're executing at a really good level, even though they're doing it by committee, which is not what you want when you're chasing Palou, and we've talked about that ad nauseum. But I think you have to ask the question: is Arrow McLaren the second best team on the grid right now? Have they overtaken Penske simply because they've got the execution down? Now, we'll find out how well they execute for the 500 compared to Penske, because we know that team did a really damn good job last year in qualifying. Team Penske did. So sweeping the front row. And so that part remains to be seen on if this can be converted to the oval program and how Christian is going to adapt to the ovals, because this is also Christian's first oval with Arrow McLaren. So, we're going to have a chance to have some questions answered with him and Nolan Siegel as well. So, but for right now, 5 races in, they look like the second best team, but it is still head and shoulders above Chip Ganassi is still head and shoulders above everyone. I mean, yeah. Alex Palou, this is one thing I did want to say about this, because before we get too crazy into the 500 speak, I think one thing to mention is Alex Palou has won every different way you could possibly win in his 4 wins through these 5 races. He's had a pole and walked off with a 16-second win at Barber. He lost the lead after having pole, lost the lead on the opening lap of the opening corner, and, just stalked his way back to the lead, overcame a late caution, jetted off, and won that one this past weekend. And then he started 8th at St. Pete, rolled through the field and did it at St. Pete. And then you look at Thermal, and he made the late pass on Pato and has done it. So he's done it a multitude of ways so far. And despite the fact that it's been all these different things and all these different changes, the mandatory tire rule at the GP, for instance, they just continue to execute. And that's why I think that this championship run so far, it has been really astonishing. And I don't want to penalize Palou's performances and his greatness just because we're struggling with where we see, the sport at the moment.
Yeah, it's I mean, you look at St. Pete too. I mean, he didn't even qualify that well. He qualified 8th. Now, some of the positions that he made up there came down to whether folks decided to start on the primary tires or whether they started on the alternates and were able to get off the alternates during that opening caution. That kind of came down to happenstance on whether we get that opening caution, whether we don't. If we don't, and say that race goes caution free, then I think you immediately have to look at the guys that started on primaries as the folks that probably end up winning that race, or at least it's an even thing, and you've got two strategies that are merging at the end, and it maybe more so comes down to who was able to run in clean air, who timed their pit stops well, who were super clean and solid in the pits to give away as little time as possible. And maybe is an even more interesting race down the wire than we had there. But yeah, I mean, it's a great point, and I'm really excited to get into this oval stretch of the season, even though the 500 is a little bit of a different beast, as we all know, compared to anything else that we have on the calendar. But ultimately, what this championship is going to come down to is how good Chip Ganassi Racing is on ovals and how dominant, say, a Team Penske or an Arrow McLaren, or if they can really turn things around, and Andretti Global can be on ovals. Because again, as we talked about in several podcasts before this, we can't have a rest of the field racking up wins by committee. This has to be one driver from one team that steals wins away, and then maybe it's a thing where Chevy just really continues to have the oval advantage, and you've got Ganassi and Palou all of a sudden not really often able to crack the top 5 because you've got Lundgaard and Pato and Joseph and McLaughlin and Power just constantly finishing in some combination of first through fifth at these ovals, and maybe throw in a strong result. If Colton and Kirkwood and Ericsson, if they prove to have a better short oval program than Ganassi does, which proved to be the case last year. So ultimately, I feel like we're not going to have a great handle on where things are until maybe we get to Gateway, midway through June, and we have our first short oval, first of 5 of those on the calendar this year, to kind of see where, how the lay of the land changes. But and I guess as I look through the field once more, this didn't really have anything to do with Colton specifically. It sounded like it was another weird mechanical thing that team was struggling with. But man, just yet another race weekend where you feel like, Colton, Herta, and that number 26 Andretti Global crew have a chance to turn the page on this year and put together a really strong performance. And he's got a best finish of 4th at Thermal, and that's his only top 5 of the year. And he's got 16th at St. Pete after a really poor pit stop in the middle of the race. He's got this mechanical failure DNF for 25th, and he now sits nearly 150 points out of first. And that number that you have to keep in mind for him to be able to get that super license before the end of the year, to have a shot at being able to compete in Formula One for Cadillac F1, is that 4th place finish. He's at 104 points and 9th in the championship. 4th place is Pato Award at 148. Now, something like this can really turn around fast if he's able to rattle off a couple wins. But if Palou is doing the bulk of the winning, and you've got kind of this group of musical chairs from 2nd to, say, 9th or 10th or 11th or even 12th, where Joseph Newgarden currently sits, kind of playing, who's going to take the podium spots and who's going to have the top 5. And we have a different group in that every single week. It's going to be really tough for Colton to make up the points and get back into that top 4. So that's someone that really stood out to me as someone who I know, I'm sure, was heading into this weekend with high hopes. And and left needing as much as ever a strong end to the month of May and the 500 to get back up into this championship and even best of the rest conversation.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, his back's not up against the wall yet because there's only a 48 point gap to that spot, but getting close, getting real close. And before we transition, I did want to give a shout out to Rinus VK and the Dale Coyne group. I mean, grabbing another top 10, and now they're sitting 10th in points, and he's ironically or coincidentally, however you want to look at it, 2 points ahead of Alexander Rossi, the guy who replaced him at Carpenter Racing. So 5 races into the season, that group no longer in the threat of leader circle right now. Not worried about that, just full steam ahead. They're meshing really well, and that's a fun team to watch, and that's going to be a really interesting team to watch for the month of May, I think.
Yeah, I mean, 3 top 10s now on the season through 5 races, more than David Malukas at AJ Foyt Racing, more than Marcus Ericsson, more than Santino Ferrucci.
No Tech Alliance.
Yeah, go down. You go down the list, more than Marcus Armstrong, more than as many as Alexander Rossi, as many as Colton Herta. It's an incredible thing that this group is doing in getting the absolute most out of the car, out of Rinus's performance, out of that pit crew's performance, showing what the true potential of one of these teams that has been at the back of the grid for these last couple of years is, if they get things moving in the right direction from an engineering perspective and have a strong driver in the car and execute well on pit stops. That's been a really cool storyline. And yes, as you mentioned, I mean, Rinus has I'd have to check my stats, but he's right at the front of the field qualifying wise, just about, if not every single year that he's been in the 500 through his 5+ year IndyCar career. So I will be very intrigued to see where that car ends up after Saturday of Indy 500 qualifying, and see if Rinus is able to put a Dale Coyne Racing car in that Fast 12, as would likely need to be one of the best Hondas that we have in the field. It's a bit of a long shot when you think of if we assume that Chevy still maybe has a little bit of an edge on top end speed, you're competing up against all 3 Penske's, probably at least 3 Arrow McLaren cars, Alex Palou and Scott Dixon and Colton Herta and Kyle Kirkwood and Ryan Hunter-Reay, Takuma Sato, those folks that we've seen up there in the Fast 12 the last couple of years. But if anyone could do it with a team that's been certainly not expected to be fighting for that, they've been fighting for just getting into the race the last couple of years, Rinus VK would be the person to do it. As we transition into Indy 500 talk for the rest of this episode, maybe we can kind of stay on a topic that we were on, talking about Colton. Who is a driver or a team of a team of drivers that you feel like really needs a boost that we sometimes see come from the month of May? I know this race doesn't pay double points anymore, so outside the points that you get from qualifying in the top 12 going to the pole sitter and 1 for the 12th place qualifier. That's the only difference that we see in terms of how valuable this race is for the championship. But from being on track, working with the team so much, learning so much from the car's performance, and having so many opportunities to execute and talk through strategy and have a driver learn about what the maximum they have in their car at their disposal, and driving well. It's certainly a race that can build a lot of momentum for the back half of the season, even if there's no other race that is like this one on the schedule. As you look at this, at least at this 27 car full-time field and the 11 full-time teams that we have at the moment, what's a pick or two that you feel like is desperate to have a good month of May over these next 2 weeks?
Yeah, so I'll give you 2 actually. And so the first one I'll say is Marcus Ericsson. We'll stay in the Andretti house. I hate that he's having just another miserable start to the year. I think the world of Marcus. I think he's a really good dude. and a really good shoe too. And, the reality is he hasn't – it's been a struggle ever since the 2023 ending of the 500. I mean, if we're being completely blunt. And there's got to be something that he could just, break free of that and create a new narrative. He wants to put that behind him with the weird finish that was a race that myself and probably plenty of other people thought should have ended under caution. But and given him the honor of being the first back-to-back champion since Elio instead of it eventually ending up being Joseph. But, you look at this, though, and another miserable start to the year. And last year at the 500, clipping the curb, tearing the car up, starting at the back of the field, barely making the race. And one thing spiraled into another. I think that at some point you got to stop the bleeding. And I think this is a perfect place to get it here, 2 weeks at a track, 2 weeks of track time, and just, really a week and a few days, but, and get in and just hone in on it and try to, he gets to, I know he lives in Indianapolis. I don't know if he's going to stay at the track or just drive in every day, but, something there to reset and to focus forward and have a good run at the 500 that we all know he's capable of, obviously, since he's won this race whenever he was with Ganassi. So that'd be my first pick, would be Marcus. And the other one I actually think would be more of a team, but with the driver, and that's Juncos Hollinger Racing with Connor Daly. And they're sitting right now 21st in points. You got to look at leader circle. He was brought in last year to help get them out of the depths and push them into the leader circle spot at the tail end of the season. And team principal David O'Neill has made it no secret that part of the reason that they brought Connor in is because he gives them a real threat to win the 500. And that's something that this team last year with Augustin Canapino was right in the thick of being in a good finish until he sped on the final pit stop. He was running sixth, sped coming to pit road on the final pit stop, and that took him completely out of getting a really strong finish. If they can flip the script on that, it'd be huge, right? Native Hoosier wins Indy 500. We all know how the crowd loves Connor. But also, this is really what he was brought in to do. I mean, full stop. We know about the oval program, we know about the road course program and all that, but this is what David O'Neill wanted him for. So I think it's important that they execute this at a high level too.
For a team that I mentioned, it's technically two teams, but I will mention them both. They're in a little bit different situations, but we'll start with the technical alliance between Team Penske and AJ Foyt Racing. The Foyt duo started this season really slow. I mean, Santino Ferrucci just had this run of top tens to pretty much close out the year last year, the most top tens the team had in decades. Finishes top 10 in the championship, just was this Cinderella of a season when you look at the championship as a whole after you got past the title contenders, and he's not yet had a top 10 this year. There's been a little bit something missing there. I mean, the first three races he goes 14th, 14th, 11. In normal situations, that's a pretty solid start to a year for an AJ Foyt Racing team, but when you look at what that team was able to do last year, it's a half step or a full step off of where he'd been, and then has had a tough go of it in 18th and 20th these last couple of races. David Malukas' start at AJ Foyt Racing certainly has not had the highs that a lot of folks were expecting out of him. Now, granted, again, David has performed best on ovals, particularly short ovals, and we have not had any of those yet on the schedule. So there's a chance for that to turn around, and he's adjusting to everything that comes with joining a brand new team and being, back full time at the start of the year, which he was not a year ago. So I give him a little grace, but we have, I don't feel like talked about AJ Foyt Racing at all on this podcast through this year. And it seemed a little surprising, given where that team was a year ago. And you look at Team Penske as a whole now, they have won each of the last two Indy 500s with Joseph Newgarden, and they swept the front row last year. There's no team that has performed better, at least once we got past qualifying for the race in 2023. beyond. So you look at the race and then you look at last year qualifying and the race, Team Penske has been head and shoulders above every single other team. And this team has they've totaled 3 podiums, one for each of their drivers through 15 races. So you got 15 potential podium spots through 5 races this year. I think having just 3 at this mark in the year would definitely have been on the underside if you were betting on how many podiums Team Penske would have coming into this point in the year. It's not necessarily worrisome that they haven't won a race yet, although if you're looking at the championship, it's going to be tough sledding to catch up with Alex Palou. Scott McLaughlin is their best in the championship right now. 111 points back in 5th place. Will Power's in 7th. And as I mentioned earlier, Joseph Newgarden with just 1 top 10 finish since his 3rd place at St. Pete. He climbs and claws his way back up to finish 12th. Joseph's got a lot riding on him in terms of pressure with no one having ever won the Indy 500 3 years in a row. I think it's going to be an incredibly tall task for him to execute on that. But you've got 2 other drivers that seemingly felt like they could win the race last year. Scott McLaughlin and Will Power. Will crashing out midway through that race, and Scott kind of never really factoring in, but getting an opportunity to run up toward the front for the first time in his career that I think is really important. I think it's incredibly tough for someone to not have ever really had that experience and then just go in and win the race on all out speed and execution. So I think there are opportunities for all 3 of these Team Penske cars, admittedly with different history on the line. Will going for his 2nd, Scott going for his 1st, and Joseph his 3rd. I think there's a really big moment for this team to turn their seasons around, and obviously for Joseph, the incredible history that he could have riding there. As I look at maybe one other driver in this championship, I feel like it's Pato O'Ward. Pato is, as we mentioned, sits 4th in the championship, has had a couple runner-up finishes, but he's been so desperately close to winning this race. Been runner-up 2 of the last 3 years, and the 1 year he didn't finish runner-up, he was making a daring pass, or attempting to make a daring pass that would have been for 2nd place with, I think, under 10 laps to go in the 2023 race. Ends up crashing in attempting to go around Marcus Ericsson heading into turn 3. I wonder what an Indy 500 victory could do for Pato O'Ward. If you're thinking of someone who could maybe challenge Alex Palou in this championship, if Pato can, get this 500 win under his belt, energize him and the rest of that number 5 Arrow McLaren Chevy group, you wonder if he couldn't go and rattle off a couple other oval victories and get himself back into the thick of this championship. And maybe, as we've talked about on a couple other podcast episodes, maybe you're all of a sudden really wondering whether Pato O'Ward gets an opportunity to go and race in Formula One, if he's battling for a championship and finally has that 500 under his belt. I think if Pato is, again, a runner-up or kind of for whatever reason, not really in the conversation this year, I really wonder if that team has a chance to go and contend for this championship. And I think a 500 win, not only what that would mean for him personally, but looking at this championship from a big picture perspective, especially if Alex Palou isn't high up there. If you get a good chunk of points on the number 10, all of a sudden you're kind of right back in this. So that's another driver that I'm looking at that I think could have some big things in store and could really use a moment like the 500 to kind of settle this super duper highs and really low lows first 5 races of the year that he has had so far.
If Pato O'Ward wins the 500, IndyCar better announce the banquet the next day that they're racing in Mexico. That right there would be interesting for the sport in terms of what it could do for growth potential.
Yeah, absolutely.
But AJ Foyt's a good shout too, by the way. It makes you wonder, because you're right, we haven't talked about them. And I don't want to get too deep in this, but I do want to say this just briefly. It makes me think, we know Michael Cannon left over the offseason. And then also we know that Santino's engineer last year, who's technically a Penske employee, is now David Malukas' engineer. So there's so much change and so much dynamic. And it makes me wonder how much that's really affecting them, because it's not just we can't just point to the Penske Alliance right now as like, hey, they were so good because they were aligned with Penske on these road and street courses. And, and Michael Cannon's influence went to Penske for the ovals, and it made it sound like it was an even trade kind of thing. Something's definitely missing, and maybe it's just because they changed up the chemistry so much.
Definitely a good point. As we finish things out here, we've got 4 days of practice before we get to qualifying weekend. We hope to have another episode for listeners of the Inside Line after we finish up Fast Friday to kind of take a look at where things stand going into qualifying weekend, kind of level set where things are. We'll learn some bits and pieces over these next 4 days of practice, crossing our fingers. It looks like a really great week of weather, knock on wood, of course, especially after what we had last year, where I hope we can learn a lot. But that Fast Friday is where you really start to get a sense of where folks are, not only in their peak speed, but their 4-lap averages as guys kind of do some mock qualifying runs. And we get into really, the boost that we see on qualifying weekend. So let's talk through a little bit as, reporters, what we look for in these first couple days of practice for folks that, either haven't been to the 500 or just kind of unsure on what teams are working on. As you are watching these broadcasts and looking at the timing sheets and the timing and scoring and how it evolved throughout each day of practice, what are some things that you're focused on before we even get to Fast Friday in terms of getting a sense of where teams are at this point in May?
Yeah, so I think these next few days, I think Fast Friday is strictly qualifying setups and stuff like that. I think you look at this Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday run, and yeah, maybe you'll have a few solo runs, but I'm not looking as much in the no-toe speeds and stuff like that. What I'm looking for is consistency among the top 5, top 10. Who are the regular names that are there on a regular basis? Because that's going to tell me who's probably got more playability in their car, who's going to have more versatility, because these drivers and teams talk all the time about how every single day is different at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. It doesn't matter if it's it could be the same temp, ambient temp, and the same wind, but for whatever reason, the track is different. Whether it just feels different. What was something that gave you understeer one day could give you oversteer the next. So, Indy is tricky like that, and that's why we love her so much. And it's one of those things that if you've got more playability, I think that you could look at some of those drivers as who's going to be contenders for the race. Qualifying is going to matter, but we're also going into this unique situation where we've now had this hybrid package at the 500. It's big oval, a lot of interesting ways to recharge the boost and staying in tow as opposed to being on brake power like we get at these road and street courses or even some of the short ovals. So I think that's the number one thing I'm looking for is who's consistently going to be, who are the 2 or 3 or 4 names that we're going to see consistently in the top 5, top 10. I think that'll give me an idea of who's probably got something to play with for race day.
Yeah, and I think kind of the opposite side of that. There's not necessarily any one day, maybe outside of Fast Friday, where you want to make a big deal at who's in the bottom of the timing charts, because so much about this race is who has a good car in traffic. And if you aren't, just getting this awesome tow or running out in clean air, you're not necessarily going to turn a great lap. And all we're seeing on those timing sheets at the end of the day is who, every single entry's best single lap. So there's so much more that comes down to this race and even qualifying than what one single fastest lap tells you about where that car is. From a racing standpoint, you're looking at who's able to suck up real close and make a pass, although you never totally know if the car ahead is running full throttle, if they were wanting to drop back, so they were kind of allowing that pass. So there's all these different things that you don't entirely know the full story on, and you're having to just have conversations and make your best guesses. I would say that I'm also looking at if someone is finishing in the bottom 5 every single day, no matter what the conditions are, no matter what it seems like different teams are working on. If you've got a team like Prema, or like Dale Coyne Racing, or throw out any other team that you want to mention, Juncos Hollinger Racing, for example. If you've got a team like that that's especially with one specific driver that is finishing down there toward the bottom, you start to wonder, is this a team that's working with slow car syndrome, like like Callum Ilott was dealing with a couple years ago, where he almost kind of got into a fight, didn't quite get to that point, was having strong words with his team after every single day of practice, feeling like there was something wrong with this car before they relented and made a full-scale chassis change. He was just toward the bottom of the timing charts, couldn't get any proper speed, felt like the car was pulling away from him as he was on the straights. If you're noticing a car like that that's finishing, in the four or five slowest every single day in all conditions, you've got to start asking some questions. And I think we've got a decent sense of who might be down there, but there could be some surprises too. I think you also look to see if anyone makes, an early crash. This is where we saw, Nolan Siegel crash. This is where we saw Marcus Ericsson crash in these first couple of days of practice. And then when you've got a team that's got such a great car built up over the essentially 12 months that we've had and since the last Indy 500, and all of a sudden, if that car is completely binned and you've got to go to a backup that, yes, you've been rubbing on a little bit, but doesn't have your best parts, has not seen the time and energy spent from the entire crew and staff and team, making it as best as humanly possible because you've made a pick on what your primary car is going to be. All of a sudden, you're starting to ask questions when the margins are so tight in this series on, is this car going to make the race? And we saw it last year from Marcus. We saw it from Nolan Siegel. He wasn't able to make the race ultimately. And we've seen it in other years too. So, I look at even over these last couple weeks, we mentioned off pod, the incredible work that the team at Ray Hall Letterman Landing and Racing did in putting together Takuma Sato's brand new car after he crashed during the open test. I certainly will be looking on Tuesday to see if that car is up toward the top of the timing charts like it had been through the first day plus of testing that we had last month. And if it's not, maybe you're not wondering if Takuma is going to make the race or not, but you're wondering if they gave up a potential Indy 500 contending opportunity because he lost it in the wall. They're going into one. And I'm also looking at Kyle Larson. They didn't have to put together a brand new chassis, but he lost some really important on track time in the crash that he had. I think it was important for him to kind of get that out of the way and know what that felt like so that he could avoid that in the future. But anyone like the Kyle that has such such few hours and miles in an Indy car, especially on a track like IMS, as great as a race car driver he is, you just wonder where he's going to stack up and where his comfort level is going to be with a car that is admittedly 100 pounds heavier than what he had when he was making his rookie debut last year.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. And, when I guess the last thing I would close with on my half is when I talk about the consistency on the lap sheets, I'm not talking about single lap pace. I'm talking like what are they over the course of 10, 20 lap runs? Yeah. I think that's what's going to matter. I don't care about the big lap. I care about the 10, 20 lap runs. And we'll get into qualifying on the as we get closer to qualifying, but that for these next few days of practice, to me, that's what's going to matter. And I'm going to be really intrigued because every year we're going to have surprises on for good reasons and bad.
Mm-hmm. Just to quickly go over kind of how these next 4 days on track will work. Starting on Tuesday, we will have 6 hours of on track running, weather permitting. If you are watching from home, those first 4 hours from noon to 4 will run on FS2, that 4 to 6 chunk, which is where we typically see a bunch of cars on track, sometimes some pack running, but typically where you start to see your higher speeds as the track cools down just a tiny bit. Those portions of Indy 500 practice will be on Fox Sports 1. Tuesday, a little bit different schedule. Every single car, all 34, will have a chance to do an install lap to start the day. And then Tony Kanaan will have a chance to do his veteran refresher program to get him qualified in case the team needs him to run in place of Kyle Larson on race day. The only situation that we would likely see that come into play is if we again have bad weather on race day and Kyle and the Hendrick Motorsports team is forced to fly off to Charlotte Motor Speedway for the Coca-Cola 600, as they have pledged to do, to so as not to lose Kyle's all the playoff points that he has and would accrue over the rest of the season if they were to require a waiver. Again, NASCAR requires all their full season drivers that want to be playoff eligible have to start all of the regular season races, and if they don't, you have to apply for a waiver. And now if it's anything other than a medical situation, anyone who has to apply for a waiver, like Kyle skipping, say, the Coke 600 to run the 500 just because it's something that he and the team want to do, would lose all those precious playoff points, and is something that the team has just decided that they are no longer willing to forego as awesome an experience and an opportunity as the 500 is. So that's the only situation where we would have Tony Kanaan in a race car, but he kind of with these new somewhat clarified rules that IndyCar has put together, he has to do a what's called a veteran refresher, which is 15 laps, I believe, at 210 to 215 miles an hour, and then an additional 15 laps above 215 miles an hour, just to make sure that he is, set and comfortable in the car. No one has any doubts on if Tony Kanaan can properly race this car at a track that he's run so many times, although it has been 2 years since he has been in a car, since he made his last 500 start in 2023. We'll be interested to talk to Tony about that, but that's there are up to 2 hours reserved for that on Tuesday. The interesting difference in how this session will go is typically in a rookie orientation program or a veteran refresher session, of which we ran all but Tony's during the open test this year. Typically those drivers get that full 2 hours, so they can run 100 laps if they want to. Especially for rookies, it's oftentimes really important just to take advantage of open track that you have where weather is allowing you to be on there and just run by yourself, just to get comfortable and get up to speed before you've got multiple guys out there. You're running in a pack, just to get a feel for things. Once Tony finishes his 30 laps, they will not let him run anymore. It's just an intricacy to this, essentially, to not let Aaron McLaren get any sort of an advantage on allowing Tony Kanaan to shake down the car or test any things on it as he's turning those laps at above 215 miles an hour. So once we finish that up on Tuesday, then we'll get probably, I wouldn't be surprised if we get to full field running even a little bit earlier, because I certainly don't expect TK and that Aaron McLaren crew to require that full 2 hours. So once we get past that, we'll have full field running for the rest of Tuesday and all Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, weather permitting. And then we get the boost turned up on Friday for Fast Friday, where teams are running qualifying boosts. You'll see a lot of 4-lap runs, maybe even some single lap runs, as guys figure out where their car is, and we'll have the qualifying draw after that and see what order teams make their initial qualifying runs, and we can dive into all of that on what qualifying weekend is going to look like on Friday evening's episode. Anything else that we need to hit on, Joey, before we finish this episode off?
Yeah, I don't think that we're going to have the headline after Tony Kanaan gets in the car of former Indy 500 champ forgets how to drive fast, turn left. So yeah,
no. I'll be interested to hear what he says and what that's like. And I'm sure there will be, I would expect Dario to be down there, giving him a hard time about coming out of retirement yet again for what it is, like the third or fourth time. But it'll be cool to see Tony in a car, after a couple of years on being on a little bit different side of things. One thing I do want to mention, we mentioned it on last week's episode coming out of Barber Motorsports Park. For those of you who are interested, again, IndyStar is giving away 2 Snake Pit VIP passes to this year's Indy 500. Get you into the race. It gets you some special access to the Snake Pit if that is the way you prefer to enjoy Indy 500 race day. I tweeted at the link. I'll do it again. But there's a page where you need to kind of just put in your information. It's free to enter. The only thing you do need, and this will be helpful for podcast listeners, 2 code words for you. The first one is Larry, the first name of Mr. First in Line, Larry Basiglia, which some of my colleagues did a really cool video package and feature on. If you don't know Larry's story, I would encourage you to go to IndyStar.com and check out really, really neat package on a really interesting icon of this race from a couple of decades ago. And then the second keyword there is milk. So go plug those keywords in, enter to try to win those snake pit tickets. Should have some more information on how long that giveaway is open. But if you haven't done it already, go and plug that in, and best of luck to folks who enter that. And again, we will have our next episode leading into Indy 500 qualifying weekend. Hope it's posted either Friday evening or early Saturday morning to get you ready for an action-packed, drama-filled weekend as we see who ends up getting bumped and which driver will start this race on pole for the 109th Indianapolis 500. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening. Send us, any questions that you have or things that you would love us to dive into on the podcast, as we have a couple more episodes before we actually get to the 500 next week. Have 2 or 3 more episodes before we get to that point. So if you have anything you'd like us to touch on, hit us up on Twitter, send me an email. Otherwise, we will see you guys again in a couple days for this next edition of the Inside Line.